So learning a language is a lot like making pickles.
I think it really is. That should be the title of the episode.
Hey everyone, and welcome to another Actual Fluency podcast. This is episode 6 of the 4th season. And in this episode, I'm talking with Mr. Andrew Feinberg, who is a contributor to Duolingo's Norwegian course and also a super guy. So hope you will enjoy this little talk with Andrew, where we get into loads of topics related to culture, language learning, living abroad, food even, and just a really nice, basic chat as the Actual Fluency podcast was meant to be. Before I let you go into this recording, I just wanted to say a couple of things. The first thing being that I know there's been a bit of a technical problem in the last few episodes where my voice has been kind of low and the guest has been kind of high. And I was only recently made aware of this, and after listening to some of the recent episodes, I can only agree. These episodes sound quite different in the finished file compared to what I hear in the editing lab. I should have been more sort of pertinent to actually test the finished product as well. And then, once I realized there was a problem, I tried to fix it, and it brings about some new problems. First of all, if I am to boost, so this is all in one recording, and audio lovers out there are probably thinking, what you're recording both into the same file? And yes, unfortunately I do. It's the most stable method I've found. I used to record 2 separate tracks, but that got confusing really quickly, and it was sometimes hard to line them up, and it also involved a lot of work. And ever since then, I've tried to use a program that puts them down into one. What I probably should have done is record stereo. That means one voice in one side and one voice in the other, so I could adjust the volume separately in a mono track later. But I didn't do that, and so now we have this problem. And I looked into it, and I tried to use some good software, and I can't really fix it for a few reasons. The main reason is that if I boost my audio only, it does sound a little bit better, but it also increases all the noise. So for instance, my old laptop that sounds like I don't even know what to compare it to. It's really noisy, and usually you can't hear it because my microphone is, pretty good usually. But if I have to boost it, you'll hear all the background noise much clearer. So I tried it out a little bit, and I realized that, what, it's probably better if you have me slightly lower so you can turn it up on your phone or device or whatever, and then the guest slightly higher. I know it's an inconvenience, and I'll do my best from the next recording forward to improve this, but for now I'm just going to have to apologize and say, there'll be some noise in this episode because I've turned up my side of the conversation basically, so you might hear my computer in the background and stuff. The other thing I just wanted to quickly mention is that I was quite sick during this episode. I had just come home from the Polyglot gathering in Berlin, I believe, and I got a pretty bad flu at about 2 weeks after I came home, and this is when we recorded this, just on the back end of a flu. So if I sound a little bit, let's say awful, it's because that's unfortunately how I was feeling that day. I hope that Andrew's great voice and energy can counter for this, because I was really, really not feeling very well. I probably should have postponed the interview, but I didn't want to reschedule for Andrew because we already rescheduled a couple of times due to technical problems. But anyway, thank you so much. And if there are any of my patrons listening out there, I just want to say thank you for supporting the show. If you want to become a patron and hang out in bi-weekly hangouts and get some behind-the-scenes files and enjoyment, then go to actualfluency.com/support. I really appreciate it. And we had our first hangout the other day, and it was good fun. So I hope to have loads of those in the future. But anyway, enjoy this talk with Andrew Feinberg. Americans are not usually totally into multilingualism, so where did you find the passion originally?
I echo the exact same storyline that so many of your guests have had.
That's
is
all
that
right.
they had Hebrew in Hebrew school, and it was a thing that I had, and I didn't learn any words exactly. Like we didn't learn the language exactly. We sort of just we learned how to read.
Right.
And that was enough for your bar mitzvah or your bat mitzvah when you were 13. And then you sort of was like, that was supposed to be the end of your Hebrew education for most people, because most people aren't really that enthused. Like this might have to do with like the low attendance rates for Reform synagogues, but like they really wasn't much of an effort to get people to learn the actual Hebrew language. So I know when a lot of Jews in America, when they read prayers in Hebrew, they know what the prayers are about, but they don't know what they're actually reading at any given time. Like you might have the 4 questions, or you might have like the mourner's Kaddish, which is like this prayer that you say when someone has died. You have it memorized, and it's sort of within your brain because it's a beautiful prayer, but you don't know what you're actually saying. And I think that that's really crazy. And I can't wait Hebrew is on my list of languages to learn in the future. I'm not at it right now, but part of the reason I'd like to learn it is so that I can actually know what I've been saying all these years. And I'm not religious anymore. I don't consider myself any religion, but I think that it's just an important part of my heritage to know what it's about. So how did I get from there to Norwegian is another story. I'd say that I wanted to pick basically the opposite of my culture in a lot of ways, and I thought that like pillaging Vikings was pretty different and not at all like anything that sort of I considered my own heritage. So it just seemed cool to me. It seemed like a really interesting parallel mythology,
Right.
sort of alongside the Greeks and the Romans. You had the thunder god and the mischief god, and like all kinds of weird stories that were made up around Norse mythology, and stuff that contributed a lot to the whole folklore of the Lord of the Rings and eventually the Game of Thrones Song of Ice and Fire storyline. And I thought that was just really, really something worth looking into. And then I started learning the language when I was 16. I had a friend who was really into this language. It was like a friend of a friend who she met through the internet. And I've just been learning it ever since. And I applied to Duolingo, and then I started teaching it on Duolingo. And then I've been on there for over a year now as a contributor to the course.
Spreading the love.
Spreading the Norwegian love. Yeah.
There you go. That's fantastic. And so the interest into culture led you to go into the language behind the culture, and then you sort of, as you develop your interest for Norwegian, you've grown that to now you're interested in studying more languages. Is that correct?
Absolutely. I first started learning German in high school because I wanted to learn Norwegian, but they didn't have it at the university where I was at.
What a surprise.
The closest thing, and I actually sort of expected them to, because they had crazy different, they had Swahili, they had Hindi and Farsi, and they had all kinds of languages, because I went to BU's high school, and you could take anything at BU.
Right.
But Boston University. But
not Norwegian.
Surprise, they didn't even have Swedish, and I felt, oh god, I have to take German. But German really did help me out with my Norwegian.
Oh yeah.
It's the vocabulary and a little bit of the grammar, but of course German is a lot more difficult, and Polish, which I'm learning right now, is just insane. I sort of ventured into Polish because I wanted to step into the Slavic languages. I know I'm going to be studying in Norway in August, and the most popular Slavic language there is actually Polish.
Right.
Because of the migration for work and etc. And
so what are you going to study there?
I'm studying, it's kind of a complicated thing. It's called transnationalism, globalization, and culture.
Mm-hmm.
It's going to be hard to put on a CV, but it's like a mix of political science and economics and the studying of trade and international relations and everything that it's pretty pertinent to what American politics is sort of focused on right now with international trade deals. And I know that I often see people posting about like the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the impending free trade agreement between Europe and the US. And that's going to be just fascinating and hopefully a little bit marketable.
Well, it sounds exciting, and if you pair it up with a few languages, I guess it's a winner.
Oh, I hope so.
And is it in Norwegian or English?
It's completely in English.
Okay, that's internationally minded.
Exactly.
They do that a lot in Scandinavia. It's not. I mean, even in Denmark, there's a lot of courses offered by the universities in English because they're trying to attract foreign students such as yourself to come and enrich the environment, so to speak, with different points of view and different experiences.
I think it's wonderful because grad school in the US can run you $100,000 easily. And in Norway, it's completely free. And so many people in my life, when I said I got into grad school in Norway, asked me, if it's really free, then why doesn't everyone do it? Right. And I always respond with, that's a great question. I really don't know why people don't do it more often.
Well, but it's sort of inconvenient. It's sort of far away. I mean, the selection of courses in English is quite limited, as you probably know. I mean, you can find usually the types of courses they would have in English would be something like that, international relations, some languages maybe. But if you want to study, I mean, you can't go to Norway and study to be a doctor in English, so... or lawyer or whatever people want to become these days. So I think it's probably a combination of like, it's far away. If you're an American, it's really far away. And they just don't have that many courses if you're not interested in international whatever, connections, politics, something like that. So, but maybe a lot of people just don't know. Could be an awareness
I think a lot of people don't know. Like, I have another friend who's studying in Germany for free. And the whole idea of going to college for free to an American who is less than 30 years old is just blows our minds. It completely blows our minds. It doesn't make sense. And it's public universities in the US, by and large, were free until... I don't know, maybe 30 or 40 years ago, like especially in the famous UCs in California were all free.
Mm-hmm.
And now they're really struggling financially and the costs keep going up.
Right. So you have cheaper universities, community colleges.
Yeah.
Right. But still not free.
Still not free. And it's just, it hasn't ever sort of been discussed. Like, it's sort of, like, so many people in the U.S. are so buried in debt because of their education, but...
Yeah, it's crazy, isn't it, to see?
Yeah.
But, I mean, it's not totally uncommon for people in countries with free university to have student debt when they leave university. It's just not as extreme. I know most of my peers definitely, when they finish their 5-year degree, would still have, maybe a mid-range two-figure debt in US dollars. So there's still some, but it's not 300,000.
No, and that's so unfair to give a human being right at the start
I
of
think so
making any
too.
money.
I think so too. It doesn't make any
Not even.
sense.
Yeah.
It doesn't make any sense, and frankly, I don't understand why so many people do it. But I guess it's just we're in this kind of template of life, or the script that is prescribed to all of us. That after school you should go to university, get a good job, work for 30 years or 40 years, whatever, get a gold watch, and then you retire.
Yeah.
I guess that's the key here. So, and a lot of money is made on the students as well. So, what can you do? So let's go back to your Norwegian learning. How did you? I mean, you're looking around in your hometown. Was it in Boston? You were thinking about starting to learn it. What did you look for initially? Like, did you go online, search like how to learn Norwegian, or did you go to the bookshop, or how did you get started?
I got started by going to the Barnes & Noble bookstore at the BU campus, which is right below the huge Citgo sign, which if you've ever seen pictures of Boston, like there's a giant Citgo sign. Regardless, that's where the store is, and I just flipped through they had a huge foreign book section, and for Norwegian they had a teach yourself book, and they had some other easy beginner books that would not even take you past like A0. If there was such a level. And I took the Teach Yourself book, and when you have so much else to do in high school, I couldn't really focus. I was on like the rowing team, and I was doing all kinds of other stuff. So I didn't have a hell of a lot of time to devote to it, but I got far enough into it to sort of get over all the initial like tiny difficulties with the pronunciation and like when to pronounce the G and when to pronounce the D and that kind of stuff. And it sort of lay dormant in my brain for a few years. I had it, I never really was very fluent in it. I had no one to practice with. And then I started on the German journey, and then only until college did I ever pick it up again. And I picked it up again when I was in Austria for study abroad. And I went to the Link website, which is run by Steve Kaufman from Canada. And his website, I think they offered Norwegian beta, but they offered Swedish as well. And I looked into Swedish, and I learned like... It's crazy because it's such a related language that it would be easy to say that it would confuse you. But I think it really helps my Norwegian when I transitioned back to Norwegian to just see the comparisons and to solidify. Like, there's a lot of discussion about, do you ever want to learn a language that's sort of in the periphery of this language in terms of its relatives? And there's a lot of discussion that is a bad thing, that it will confuse you.
Right.
But in searching for a Slavic language to learn, I also picked up some books on Czech and Croatian, and I learned a little bit of Russian. And it just, to me, it like to have the background noise of those other languages, I think really helps you tune into the differences and similarities in a way that I think really works for me. And it can still be easy, like to mess up even in this like late stage. Like I remember being at the airport in Oslo and saying "jättebra" instead of "kjempebra," and and this is like years and years after. So, I mean, I think like it can produce funny little results, but I think ultimately it was a good decision I made to just sort of like see the differences.
Right. And if you want to learn Swedish later, then you've got those basics as well.
Yeah. I really don't feel like I need to learn Swedish because
well, me neither.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on. As long as you know, if you have one of those three mutually intelligible languages, as long as you know what you need to do to sound like suitable to the person you're speaking with, you can get by. When I was in your home country about a month ago, I had like a half an hour conversation with someone in Danish.
Wow.
And it felt really sweet, but like we both had to speak really clearly as best as we could.
Sure.
And I had to have had like the Norwegian that I had on Duolingo. I'm sorry, the Danish, in order to sort of understand like just the feeling for it. Because it can sound like when a Norwegian tries to speak in Danish, it can sound like it's exaggerated.
Oh, yeah.
Like it can sound like I often hear that like Americans, when they try to speak in a British accent, they often sound like Oliver Twist. And
sound like Oliver Twist. That's hilarious.
Yeah, and the same can be said when because Norwegians are fascinated by the Danish accent.
Sure, yeah.
But they often overdo it when they.
So how does it feel as an American with this mutual, understanding? Because I can imagine that it must be harder on some points to understand the others because you don't have that kind of very deep, long experience with the Scandinavian languages. But did you have, apart from you having to speak a little slower and clearer, which by the way is the same for me speaking to Norwegians and Swedish people, it's exactly the same. There's no difference there. But did you find it more challenging than you expected, or did you find it pretty much as you expected in terms of difficulty?
I had one other experience when I was living in Boston where I had a little meetup with the Scandinavian enthusiasts, and there was one woman there who had learned an old Danish dialect from like 100 years ago that was passed down in her family like after they left Denmark, and it was kind of an older version of Danish. And I was able to speak with her just fine. And I felt like, oh, that's just like Danish and Norwegian were basically the same written language for hundreds of years. So I felt like that would be an easy enough transition as long as we spoke slowly enough.
Sure.
But when I think I only realized that I could speak with Swedes when I was at the first Polyglot Berlin conference a year ago that I went to. And there were a few women there from Finland, but they only spoke Swedish. They didn't speak Finland. They grew up without learning the Finnish language, but speaking with them when they spoke Swedish was just completely no problem. And that really took me aback because I'd never tried speaking with a Swede, and it was just it was far easier than I thought it would be. I think cool. in part because of the like learning the sound differences that I did when I was in Vienna, learning it on my own.
Right. It's pretty cool though, isn't it? You just get a language for free.
Yeah, it's something I've tried to do I've tried to maximize the utility, like often when I research what language to learn next, I often Google like what's the most mutually intelligible Slavic language. And because I have my sister's boyfriend's brother-in-law, which is quite the connection.
Yeah.
But he's from Belarus and he speaks Russian. And speaking with him, he says, "Oh, like there's really no big deal. Like when two people speak a Slavic language, you can pretty much get what they're talking about if they're really basic." And I said to myself, "Oh, like I have to learn. I feel like in order to get my foot in the door in the Slavic world, I should learn an easy Slavic language." But the thing is that there's no such thing.
Yeah, it's like an oxymoron, yeah.
Slavic languages are so conservative and contain so many features that make them hard.
Oh, yeah.
I'd say for it's just absolutely mind-boggling that the word if in Polish is broken down by gender and number.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a particle that seems like it should be completely independent of nouns and noun declension. But then you, like, if you want to use a noun and then a verb, and then you want to describe this noun, like, for, like, he is good, like, on jest dobrze, it would be, like, that dobrze is in the nominative case, but he is a man would be in the instrumental case. Yeah. And he is not a man would be in the genitive case.
Oh, God, yeah.
And these three cases are things you have to learn to say the most basic things. So in German, you can begin with sort of nominative, and then you can move into accusative, then dative, then genitive, and it can all go very gradually. When you start learning Polish, you have to learn everything at once, it seems.
Yeah, it's notoriously hard.
Yeah, and it only starts to sink in once you've just put hours and hours into it.
Right. Is it on Duolingo yet?
Oh, absolutely. I finished the tree.
So you're keeping it golden, and
I'm trying my best. But even on Duolingo, if I feel like if I got all of those words just burned into my brain, I still wouldn't be able to read a news article or something like that.
Of course. Speaking of Duolingo, that's something that people often like to take, well, as they say in England, take the mickey out of sometimes. What do you think about, obviously you're a contributor to Duolingo, you're perhaps a little bit biased, but in your eyes, what are the main strengths of using Duolingo to learn languages with?
I'd say, let me first start out by saying I'm not an official spokesman of any kind. But I'd say what I really like about Duolingo is that they're scientifically based. They have a series of A/B tests to determine the best methods that people learn languages with. And if something doesn't work, they'll remove it. And they'll always test everything on half the user base in order to see if it improves learning. Right. And that level, that like kind of organic progression that the program goes through is something that I find really impressive. And the quality of the course, though, and the quality of its pedagogy, of its ability to teach, is something that's somewhat dependent on the people who volunteer for the course.
Sure.
So if the volunteers are not putting in the time, energy, and effort to make a well-structured course, then the course might not be great. And as tempting as it is to think that the quality of all the Duolingo courses is equivalent across the languages, it's not perhaps the case.
Well, it's different people, isn't it? I mean, yeah, but maybe some people don't know that Duolingo is not. Of course, they're producing all the languages, but it's more they're more organizing volunteers than producing it themselves. So you don't have that kind of quality, not control necessarily, but it's just each course is their own is its own kind of living creature. You know, it evolves differently from all the other courses. They might start with the same template, some of them, but then the volunteers kind of take it in this direction. So I don't think that's a very fair criticism. Like, oh, the Danish course was much better than the Norwegian course. Well, I mean, that doesn't make any sense.
I think they evolve at different levels, but the criticism that I have is that I'd say that it's just dependent on, like, all the courses will get better over time. but they'll have different starting places, and they'll have different. I think that to learn a language, there's a somewhat of a logical progression that the grammar needs to be introduced in the vocabulary. And sometimes I feel like that for certain courses, it's a little bit out of place.
It's right. The method is perhaps not so good with really grammar intensive courses, because you need to have lots of those info sheets or whatever it's called, the note pages or whatever. Whereas other languages like English, it will be very obvious what the changes are, what the new knowledge is. But for languages like Russian, you need a lot of, by the way, this is how you do this kind of in between stuff from all the translation and the pick out the right image or whatever they have now for the active learning parts.
I'd say that the courses are very well structured in general, and I think that the volunteers only build the courses that have fewer than 5 million or so learners. So the really big courses are developed by the people who actually work at Duolingo.
Sure.
And I don't want to get off on a tangent saying that, like, oh, these courses contain giant errors or or like gaps in pedagogy. Just to say that I'd say that by and large they are built by pretty devoted people. Some of them do stall out, like in development. There might be a year before a course really gets off the ground.
Sure.
And so there can be a little bit of, it can be some disappointment because everyone's sort of waiting for this one course. And you might have to wait a bit. Like there's a huge culture of people just saying, this course is fully developed. It's at 100%. Why can't I learn it? So there's a huge process that involves implementing the audio and making sure that it runs smoothly and that it tests smoothly. And that's so beyond the point of what the contributors are able to do. And it's now in the hands of the developers who are working the code behind the scenes.
Sure. What do you think about the actual learning that's done? That's another criticism that often comes up when talking about Duolingo. People say, well, a lot of people who use Duolingo are teenagers who just put it on their phone because it was the top of the Google Play market or iOS market, and while they are doing the lessons, they're not really learning that much. Do you think, how much do you think you learn with Duolingo if you had to kind of compare it before and after of you've done a course? I haven't done one, so I have actually no idea how much you actually do learn if you wanted to.
It really depends on the language and how easy the language is to begin with. Mm-hmm. So with the Norwegian course, you can. It's more of an exposure thing. Duolingo is perfect for exposing to you how a language sounds and how it's written. Mm-hmm. They're still working on the component of producing the language from you. I'd say that there was a long time, a lot of people, the algorithms sort of pushed people into translating into English or into the native language from the language you were learning, and not so much the other way around. And that eventually they're going to develop, hopefully soon, and implement this robot or chatbot device that will allow you to communicate naturally with a computer. At least that's how I understand it from the CEO's interviews.
Yeah.
In order to better facilitate kind of spontaneous learning, spontaneous conversation. Exactly. But I think that at this point, going through the entire Polish course from beginning to end, not knowing a single word in Polish at the beginning, I'd say what I know now that I didn't know then is Polish spelling, Polish pronunciation, the rhythm of the language, the very basic structures and patterns of the language. I've been exposed to a lot of vocabulary that I could easily build on and recognize.
Mm-hmm.
And I can speak in a very caveman kind of Polish, but I'm not going to be having fluent conversations until I really keep up with it. And like, I'm a huge believer in the input hypothesis.
Sure.
But I think you have to listen to and read and write any given word in any given conjugation 10 times before it actually sticks in your brain. You have to keep forgetting in order to remember.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something that's really frustrating because you have to go through 10 different failures of not knowing a word before you actually do know the word. And if you let one of those instances trip you up, you're going to lose a lot of steam. But you have to just keep saying, like, all this failure and all this non-recognition, all this not knowing what the word means is going to lead you to actually knowing what the word means at the end of the day.
Right. And also, I think what I usually say is there are very few methods in the world where you're going to end up with that useful, fluent language at the end if you only use that method. I mean, a teach yourself or an assimil might have you further along the way, but it takes a lot longer to get through, I would imagine. Definitely getting through properly and not just glancing through. But one method on its own is rarely enough to produce a high level in a language. So I always say, well, if you're on your phone, if you have a commute or something, might as well put on a bit of Duolingo, have some fun with it. And, well, it can't hurt you to get extra exposure to the language.
No. I'd say I don't ever, I remember being bad at speaking German. And then but I had all the grammar in my head from German classes. And I just didn't have I couldn't get used to hearing myself actually speak fluent sentences until I attended like a bunch of the Kaffeestunden that they were having at these like coffee clutches that they had at the German house where I went to school.
Mm-hmm.
And having those only German moments, like, that got my fluency up. But at the same time, it couldn't have happened if I hadn't had the years and years of having it in the background. I think it's a two-step process. You first flood your brain with the language to the point of drowning, to the point of, like, I know these verb forms backwards and forwards, and I can say them in my sleep. And the use of it can only come after that.
Sure. I definitely agree, and I also think that you can strengthen a language without studying it as well. If you give it if you work a lot on a language like German, if you learn a lot of words and then you take a break for a few weeks, I find that I'm usually stronger in the language when I come back because it's kind of been, I don't know, brewing in my brain, or my brain has had time to assimilate or whatever. And
brain has been mating.
Yeah. Basically, it's been brewing all the input that I've been giving it. So I don't think people should be worried about taking a break once in a while and just let those memories kind of settle in.
I was amazed by being about halfway through. I went about halfway through the Polish Duolingo tree in like a sprint that took maybe 1 or 2 weeks. And I said to myself, like, I came back to it months and months and months later, and I said to myself, I'm not going to remember anything.
Right.
It's been such a long time. But it comes back so fast, and so many of the patterns stick in your brain that you never thought would, that it's I liken it a lot to like taking a nap or a rest. When you go to sleep, your brain like recycles all these thoughts.
Yeah.
And it's something that's really healthy for your mind to think about other things. And I think this has a lot to do with my initial conversation about learning Swedish and then learning Norwegian, if you sort of go back and forth, it and just expose your brain to other things, it sort of hits the reset button.
Yeah. I like that. I mean, our brains are so incredible. I really think so.
And I think variety is also really important. I'm someone who doesn't really can't really get a book to trap. I can't get very many books to sort of keep my attention for more than a week. Mm-hmm. But I just bought this Lonely Planet Polish phrase book, and it explains the grammar in tables that's surprisingly useful. And I think that because something like a phrase book is trying to get as much useful information into your head in such a quick time, it does help in a way that if I didn't have this, I would be really lost.
Right.
And using easy readers, I remember going to the fantastic Kaufmann bookstore in Berlin, and I got these 3 books in easy Latin, easy Italian, and easy Polish.
Right.
And of course, there's no such thing as easy Polish, but it's as close as you can get.
Easier Polish.
Easier, exactly. And they have some little poems and short stories about pretty, the girl goes to the store and she buys an ice cream cone and it falls on her lap, that kind of stuff.
Your first reading experience in your original school, in primary elementary school.
Right.
Where you have learning your first language.
You have to start with a super simple vocabulary.
Right. What do you use to expand your vocabulary?
I'm sorry?
What do you use to expand your vocabulary now in your various languages?
That's tough. I'd say it depends on how far along. I'd say for a language like Polish, where I'm still definitely in the A levels, I would use an easy reader or a graded reader. Mm-hmm. I'm a little bit better in Italian, and there's an easy reader I just got at a bookstore that has CD that comes along with it.
Oh, wow.
Which is good to get kind of the flow, even though Italian's pretty phonetic.
Yeah, pronunciation. I mean, there'll be things to pick up for sure.
I would say for a language that's sort of in the B range, I think you might want to move toward a book that's on the easier side, or a newspaper.
Right. Do you use any lists or flashcard apps or any of that stuff?
I don't. I'm fascinated by the idea of I think it's called the Swabish list.
Okay.
And that's the lists that have the most frequent words in the language. But they always tend to be the same kind of things, like woman, man, child, things like that. And those are the things that you really have to get drilled into your head in the very beginning sections of any given course. But I think that if you're exposed to them enough times, if you see a word enough times, you'll just make a mental note of it, that this is a word that's really common, that's really important, and I need to memorize.
Right. And
I think that exposure in a given context is going to be way more useful than a flashcard.
Right. Yeah,
I'm very a fan of, you won't really learn the word dla, which means for, in Polish, unless it's in a context where that would actually make sense.
Yeah, so you'd learn a whole sentence to learn that one word would make more sense.
Yeah.
But you can have sentences on flashcards.
You totally can. And I think I forget which famous, quote-unquote famous polyglot once said this, but they never have flashcards in their mother tongue. They always try to make the flashcards completely in the other language.
Right.
Or using some kind of a picture.
Right. Gabriel Weiner did that, for instance. I know he doesn't have English on his flashcards. He just has a picture representation of the flashcard, or something like that, which is also kind of strange, but it works.
It works. I'm someone who, I think for flashcards that can really work. I still get a good amount of. I still get the feeling that, like, when you translate sentences on Duolingo, it's ultimately going to help you.
Sure.
Because I think, like, the pedagogy of Rosetta Stone is, we're not going to teach you anything with English. We're going to use just images, and you're going to get everything through context. But so many abstract verbs and nouns, you really just need a straight-up translation.
Yeah.
You're going to need, one of my favorite sources to use is Wiktionary, which doesn't have every word in the world, but I think Wiktionary in combination with something like Forvo is just an incredible combo.
Yeah.
Have you heard of Forvo?
Yeah, it's the pronunciation thingy where people submit them pronouncing their own language.
I think it's absolutely brilliant.
It's great crowdsourced pronunciation examples. It's quite good. It has a huge database for many languages.
It's amazing and
free.
Like, if you only have, like, the IPA to go on, you're still not going to be able to pronounce that, like, crazy Czech R. Right.
Well, and obviously losing out on the pronunciation is something that a lot of home students do, because you only have to teach yourself, or the whatever textbook you've chosen, or the SML even. And like me, sometimes people are too lazy to put on the CD, so you just read. I do that all the time, and it's just really terrible because it really halts the progress in pronunciation, but too hard.
I'd say that, if you, like, the audio is so important for the rhythm of the language.
Yeah.
When I bought these two books, I bought the full Complete Yourself, like, it was on sale, which is why I bought this just because it was on sale, but it was the Complete Greek Teach Yourself booklet and CDs alongside the Italian one. And I have all these CDs now, and I just looked at my computer and I said, I don't have a CD player in my computer. This is something I'm going to have to buy on Amazon. So I went and bought this, like, this brilliantly, like, strange piece of technology called a CD player.
An external CD player.
Yeah, it's such a strange, like, time warp to plug this into your computer.
Yeah.
It used to be so convenient, and now it's so inconvenient. What else works like that?
I'm old enough to remember when CDs were introduced. Not the music. They were quite ahead. I mean, they were very popular when I grew up. But the PC CD-ROMs, you could put in the computer. I remember using diskette discs a lot, and they were just terrible. They were awful. Like, there's no space on a cassette. There just isn't. And then when the CDs came out, I was like, wow, you can have 600 megabytes on one CD. These small, tiny discs would only have like a couple of megabytes each. So to install Windows, I remember installing Windows 3.1 using discs, and it was like 19 discs.
Yes, I remember my dad having a copy of, like, Windows 95 with like just a bunch of floppy disks.
Yeah, exactly, floppy disks. So they were just so terrible. So when the CDs came out, I was like, wow, this is amazing technology. And now we've just sort of gotten rid of it in favor of USBs and memory cards and all this, which is, of course, brilliant. But
direct downloads.
Yeah, direct downloads. Why do you, like, my internet today is faster, like, by a factor of probably 10 of what my hard drive could even transfer back then. So why do you need storage? But then again, you find a nice old teach yourself or whatever, and they're like, here's your CD. In fact, I have an SML CD in front of me. Ungarisch ohne Mühe. And
I love that.
luckily, my computer is, I don't know if it's good enough or old enough or whatever it is, but it actually does have a CD drive, and I can put it in. But I like what Colloquial have done with, they put all their audios online.
Yes, I love that.
So when you buy a Colloquial book, in fact, you don't even need to buy a Colloquial book. You can just go and download them. I don't know how useful they would be without the book, but they're for free online, so you don't need to worry about all these stupid CDs and discs and stuff, because it's really inconvenient, especially if you don't even have a CD drive.
Yes, I think Colloquial has done something that I like when companies do, which is they sort of give in to a technological change.
Yeah, no, they're not like giving in; they're just adapting. I think.
I think perhaps that's too strong of a word, but they make a concession that is a positive step forward, and that gives them it's positive for their brand.
For sure.
Because they sort of level with the customers, that the customers know they don't want CDs and that their real product is the books.
Yeah, I just don't like when I go to the SML shop, I have the option of, do you want to buy the book or the book and the CD? Because to me, they're like both integral parts of the product. It's like buying a computer without a keyboard. It's like, would you like the computer and the keyboard, or would you just like the computer? And it's like, well, I can't really use it without a keyboard, can I? So
it depends on if you already have let's say you have the language as a heritage language. Uh-huh. It's a language you've learned all your life through your childhood, but you just never got around to read and write it.
Mm-hmm.
It would be perhaps sufficient to have the text.
But I think you learn better with the audio anyway, even if you know how it's supposed to sound. I still think your memory is better. You learn better because of the memory hooks of seeing it and listening to it at the same time.
I'd agree with that.
But we'll see. I haven't actually tried this. I think this is actually more of a software, but it looks kind of old. And I mean, we'll see what happens. I promise to take a look at it. And it says on the back, for Windows 2000, XP, Vista, Windows 7, not Mac OS.
Yes.
That's pretty aggressive.
Oh, I was very frustrated. This first CD drive that I bought was not compatible with my computer because I had a Mac. And it seems like, darn it, like even in this age where almost everyone, I don't personally have an iPhone, but almost everyone, it seems like, where I work has an iPhone, and like Apple has sort of come to its own. Mm-hmm. But there's just so much that still is incompatible.
Yeah, and also the fact that they were I think they were some of the first companies to get rid of the CD drives as well, just to have lighter PCs, like the MacBook Air. I guess the first MacBook Air was probably one of the first ones that didn't have it, and now I don't think many of their computers even have a CD drive. Definitely not the 13-inch and below, I suspect. I don't know the entire range, but I think a CD drive is quite rare in these portable laptops these days.
I'd say for sure.
But then again, who needs a CD drive? You can just download. Just download away from anywhere.
Hey, yeah. Unless you have these teach yourself CDs.
Right, you need those, yeah. Well, you could probably copy them to your computer so you don't have to load them from the CD every time.
I've done that, but just every time you get a new one.
Yeah. It's annoying, isn't it? But I guess these are old courses, so you can't really fault them for not going with the times, but I got the new Teach Yourself French. I don't know how new it is, but it's definitely a new print. It seemed very fresh. And that came with a CD as well.
How far into French are you?
0.
Okay.
I haven't started it.
I'd say French is remarkably useful.
Okay. Especially when you go into Canada, I imagine.
Oh yeah. Oh my gosh. Like Montreal, like
Yeah.
on a face value is a bilingual city,
Right.
but I'd say the vast majority of the daily life that's done in Montreal is in French.
Unfortunately, I just gave away my teach yourself French because I knew I wasn't going to learn French in the near future. So I said to my friend, "You can have it until I need it."
Yeah. You might have to call him back.
Yeah, I'm like, hey, dude, give me my book back. But I don't know. I feel like when I go travel somewhere for very temporarily, I understand a lot of people are saying, well, I'm going to Greece this summer or whatever. I want to learn some Greek so I can talk to locals and stuff. But I'm not really in a position with my current priority languages where I can just throw up. Not throw up, that would be horrible, but just throw everything away and just kind of, okay, now I'm just going to learn French for a month or two. It would be useful, I'm sure, but for me, it's just a distraction right now. I mean, I'm sure I'll be fine with English in Canada.
Yes.
It's not like it's going to change my life if I speak French. And I know some words, and half of the vocabulary is English anyway, and I had it in school, so I'm sure there's some rusty French there somewhere, but I don't do the whole, I'm going to Spain on Tuesday. Don't really have any Spanish whatsoever. I might get a phrase book in the airport or something and just try and practice it a little bit. Maybe do a quick memorize course or something, or maybe even the Duolingo course. I guess I can binge that. But the point is, I don't really do these. I see them as distractions mainly. I know some people get a lot out of it, but for me, it's just, I think it's a kind of a waste, especially if you're going to a massive tourist area where that's going to be English speakers there for sure.
I think it really just depends on. I think when I went to Puerto Rico about a year and a half ago, just being able to order my coffee and like breakfast in Spanish gave me such a ridiculous thrill. Was like it just gave me such satisfaction. That's something I can remember vividly right now, even though it was a year and a half ago. So
you like to prepare for your trips with a little bit of language study.
Yeah, especially if it's a language that you can kind of like dust stuff off the shelf. And say like, oh, like I remember this fine bottle of wine, or like this is something that I can really bring back to life and try out and test out. Like it's the point of polyglotism is to sort of have this ever expanding library.
Sure.
Of like tricks to pull out. And of course, you have to, these books get dusty. The languages get rusty.
Of course.
Did not mean that to rhyme, but the
you Dr. Seuss now or something, or
exactly.
What's it called? Cat in the Hat or whatever.
You can. It's amazing how I remember my German accent was a lot better, like 2 years ago, than it is right now, and right now it's very harsh.
Okay,
but I guess that's somewhat appropriate. But and I remember seeing words that I knew at one point.
That's brutal.
That's the worst feeling in the world. When you actually knew something and now you just see it and you're just, yep, I got nothing.
That's tough, yeah.
But if you do look up the word in the dictionary, you are going, like, that word is going to come rolling back.
Sure.
It's going to be
strengthening it.
Yeah, and like I can't wait to. There's so many people at the Polyglot Gathering. By the way, I listened to your talk at the gathering after the fact, but I just was very impressed, and I thought it was a very eloquent and well-spoken speech.
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure, and being at that gathering like a few weeks ago, it just impressed upon me you have people there of all ages and all walks of life. Yeah. And the people who are who have been learning languages all their lives, it's just like that's something to aspire to be.
Yeah.
And because you can tell that they have such a sense of fulfillment from their hobby.
For sure. It's very impressive, isn't it, when you see these badges that are just completely full of stickers, and they have a story for each of them, which is just incredible. Like, oh yeah, in 78 I lived in the Ukraine for 6 months, and I learned the language, and I went to the discos, and met my future wife, and you have all these great stories that are only possible when you go beyond your, I don't want to call it comfort zone necessarily, but I think a lot of people get stuck in their own little world, whether it's their own country or their own job or whatever. A lot of people just go on holiday once a year. They don't actually go on any adventures, and if they go on holiday, it's like go to the tourist area, stay in the resort or whatever. They definitely don't learn any new languages so they can actually talk to the locals. But then you see people, like you mentioned at the gathering, who basically did that all their lives, just go learn all these languages, which became doorways into culture, which became even more culture, and the experience and the tales they can tell of, oh yeah, I went to Burma and I lived in Taiwan, and I agree with you. For me, that's some of the highlights, just to talk to these people, and luckily I get the pleasure to do that also here in the podcast, talk to just these people who have been doing it for so long, and for them that's just life, and I really enjoy the idea of just learning a language a year, and seeing the world, traveling around, staying a few weeks in new places, meeting new people, trying new foods and stuff like that. That sounds like a nice life.
That's a beautiful way of framing it. I'd say something I really wanted to touch upon that I just sort of, it's been like moving over in my brain ever since I first thought of this, is that I'm at a point in my life where I'm 25 now, and it seems pretty young to a lot of people, but I feel like the train is starting to accelerate, so to speak, and seeing the months and the years go by faster and faster. And it's like this, the German word for it is Torschlusspanik. Okay. Which means like the anxiety of watching a gate close. Right. And it's a wonderful word that perfectly describes like where I am in life right now, where I am worried that opportunities are going to slowly kind of like close on me. And so you have to start planting the seeds now to pluck the harvest later. And I mean, I watched my grandma like suffer with dementia and throughout her old age, and it's this point where I really want my brain to stay active, and I really want this time, as best as I can get it to slow down. And nothing makes time slow down than practicing Polish grammar.
You should make a T-shirt with that.
I absolutely should, and I'll take your idea. But it's when you learn new languages, I think it just like it completely like throws your identity through a loop.
Oh yeah, exactly.
And I think that's something that like really it's not talked about at all in school. It's something that I think when you test out this other you, and you realize that like, oh my God, I have a different voice when I speak in German, and I have a different voice when I speak in Spanish. When I speak in Spanish, I sound like a radio announcer. And I think that like, which is like a very like suave, deep Mexican male voice, which is just because I've that's the I don't know, like watching commercials and announcements in Spanish was how I was exposed to the language.
Yeah.
And it's brilliant to think about like, oh, these influences of like, who do you sound like? Well, you sound like, everyone tells you sound like your parents. And it's not just because of your biology, but because of, and not just because of your like the way that your your throat is formed, but it's just because that's the way you sound. Like you've grown up speaking in that manner.
Yeah, and you listen to them say it for many years, so that's who you are.
And I hope I don't sound like the German commercial announcers, because they sound like there's something about it that's like nails on a chalkboard to me.
Right.
But like when someone is posting on German, like "Diese Zeit ist anders," like it just like
Right.
it's like, to me, I hope I sound. I've heard a lot that like a lot of why people have accents, and I'm someone who's very much who likes to keep his American accent in other languages to a certain degree, because I think it sounds enticing and foreign and sexy in a certain way. It can, but I heard that a lot of the reason why people maintain accents is because they're afraid of sounding like they're making fun of the other culture.
Yeah, I've heard about this, yeah.
And it's true that like when I don't want to, when I speak French or German, like you don't want to sound like you're overdoing it.
No.
And
but that's a good idea. I've heard from lots of top performers. They told me that you have to exaggerate in the beginning with the pronunciation. And yeah, I mean, the native speakers are going to be a little bit puzzled about it, but I don't think they don't see it as that you making fun of them. They just they find it curious, because I've tried it lots of times with Danish, because obviously the Danish pronunciation is quite hard, and so I usually get two very different learners of Danish. One is I'm speaking with my normal accent in Danish, which obviously sounds horrible, and then there's I understand that Danish is a different accent, so I'm going to overdo it a lot. And these people sound really funny to Danish speakers, but at no point whenever I've heard it, I never believed that they were making fun of it or just, being disrespectful or anything. So I think that's mostly a limiting belief that that's what's happening. And I think that if we want to improve pronunciation and sound more native, we need to actually really embrace that inner voice that you just mentioned, that embrace that radio announcer. If that's what you sound like, just go all in, and really make it, really sell it, because that's when you get the whole, oh, I thought this was your first language, or whatever. And you don't get that if you just kind of really sit back and have no confidence when you speak and all these things. So that's what I would do. And this is advice that's forwarded from experts that I've talked to. It's not. I didn't discover this myself, and my pronunciation in languages are certainly lacks some improvement. Is desirable. Let me just put it that way.
I remember when I was in Berlin and I was hanging out with friends who were by and large Germans, who were on the German for English team, Daniela and Alex. Mm-hmm. They're two amazing people. And I asked them, like, do I sound German? Like, what is it about my accent that sounds not German? And they said, you sound pretty German, but you pause at weird places.
So it's what you don't say that's making you sound not German.
Exactly. Like, you pause it at points where you're thinking of something and you're about to say it that would not sound natural for a German. And I think it all has to do with word order.
Probably, yeah. You're kind of thinking of the English word order while you're saying a completely different one. Maybe.
Yes, and it takes a great amount of drilling into your head for that word, the German word order, to sound natural in a dependent clause. That kind of thing. Mm-hmm. Or like the word order in German is like a symphony. It's something that has to be orchestrated. And it's so much more, it brings about a lot more stress when you speak a language like German than a language like Norwegian or Danish that has pretty much the same word order as English. Mm-hmm. And Polish has, Polish, they just basically, I mean, it's kind of subject, verb, object, but they can really put it any way they want to. It's a lot like Russian.
Well, that's the good thing about Slavic languages, I think, is that it's very contextual. I don't know if that's the right word to use, but they kind of push the thing that's important at the front. Whereas English and German, of course, as well, you'll wait until the next full moon until you hear what the sentence is all about.
Right.
It was just kind of funny sometimes when you hear an English speaker speak. You really need to listen for ages to kind of get the gist of the sentence. Whereas in Hungarian and also in Slavic languages, there's a huge tendency to actually say the important stuff first, which is really cool, I think. It makes a lot of sense. It does give some problems for learners because you're not quite sure what word order to use because it's completely flexible because of the cases and stuff like that. So I'll often get the feedback from my Hungarian friends that yes, that sentence is correct, but we would never say it like that. We would say blah blah blah, different word order. So that's the challenge to sound native. There's no kind of rule. You can say it's a rule of thumb that they put the most important stuff first, but in practice, it's just probably whatever they've heard everyone else say all their lives. So they just kind of conform to one sentence. And for instance, if there are more important things in a sentence, is it more important A or B, and so on and so forth. So that's definitely challenging for me.
I think every language treats that emphasis factor in a slightly different way. And I think that in a language like English, you have the change in tonality to stress a certain word over another.
Yeah.
But can often just be brought about by the grammar itself, or like by the what you would call, like there's a lot of schwas in English words that don't, or words that are not pronounced, I mean syllables that are not really pronounced, that's sort of mumbled in American English especially.
Oh yeah.
And especially like the infamous example is 50 versus 15. Like when you're saying like how much does it cost? We're meeting him at 9:15. We're meeting him at 9:15. Like it sounds like it's so ambiguous.
Yeah.
That in order to clarify it, you have to really you have to spell it out. 915 versus 950. And it's crazy that we have not developed a way around that yet in our language. We have so many weird, they're common enough words that you'd think that we would have established some other word or some different way of pronouncing it, because we just repeatedly bump our heads on like things like I did and I didn't. They're so
yeah, it can be very close.
They're complete opposites, but like they're so, the difference between them is like a swallowed nasal nothing.
Yeah, or can or can't, which is probably more pronounced in British English, but
American English is just can or can't.
Yeah.
Which is just like, holy moly.
And how often do you hear people say, did you say can or can't?
You hear it almost every day. Almost every day. It's like people say English is this great, wonderful, perfect. Well, it's not perfect by any means, but you'd think like at this point we have sort of ironed out all the ambiguities.
Right. No, not at all.
Much.
It's a funny language.
Gosh.
I don't envy people who are actually learning English, actually. I think it's a very difficult language.
I'd say I feel, it's the luckiest feeling in the world to realize that your mother tongue is the one that everyone else is trying to learn.
Right.
But at the same time, you have to sort of, you have to recognize that just because everyone's trying to learn your language doesn't mean that you're opted out of, or you get excluded from learning theirs.
No, not at all. That's half the fun, isn't it?
Yeah, and it's all about, and I'd say, I love the Itchy Feet comics, and there was a great comic about, like, when you try to speak French in Paris, like, and you don't do a very perfect job. Like the Parisians will get mad at you and they'll speak back to you in their English.
Right.
But if you're outside of Paris, if you're in just a rural village in France, when you speak broken French, you will get adored for doing so.
Oh yeah.
And that, like, the most amazing feeling I think that you can have in language learning is just meeting someone for the first time who says, I only speak this language and I don't speak English.
Yeah.
And I'm only communicating with you right now because you put in the time and effort to learn this language that was not your own. And it's just such a warm feeling. And I have remembered it in pretty much every language that I've studied up to that level.
Right. Yeah, it's a nice feeling. There are lots of nice feelings in languages. For instance, the moment you realize that you actually understand some stuff that's going on, or you can use it, or you can read an article, and you just think back and say, a year ago I didn't understand anything in this language, let alone, an article or or some kind of speech. I find that very rewarding as well. But for me, just going back to the whole life path or journey. The polyglot journey was what I called it, and I think it makes a lot of sense, because what you essentially do is you're taking language, which people often consider a tool, and you actually turn it into so much more. Because I think I'm not learning languages actually to necessarily use it for any particular purpose. I know some people, of course, do that. But for me, it's more that, first of all, the mental exercise of improving yourself, improving your mind, and it's also getting to be able to communicate with more people and learn about their world. So, for instance, you can visit Hungary and you can have a great time in Budapest without speaking any Hungarian, but you're never going to understand exactly what the locals think like. You're not going to understand their world. And I think it was Wittgenstein, the old drunken German linguist, philosopher, whatever, who said that the limits of my world is the limit of the language I speak, or the languages I know. And I think that's so true, because for me, one of the most enriching experiences is just to learn about other cultures through the language, because you can't really learn how people think unless you actually learn their language. And I feel like when you make that your life, to learn about other people's language and culture and experience things, whatever happens, you're gonna have a good time. And I think opportunities are gonna arise. Like I can mention so many things that have happened for me just because I started learning languages. I've been to New York City. I'm going to Canada for the first time in a month. I've been to Berlin several times. I've traveled the world. I've made friends around the world. And these are things that wouldn't have happened. I even got a job because of the polyglot community. Made lots of really important friendships and really like-minded people I met. And I think if you make languages your life, there's always going to be something for you job-wise or opportunity-wise that is really going to trump everything that you would have if you just went, I'm just going to go to my local school, get a job, and just stay in my home country forever and take a holiday every year. It's just such a different experience. It's hard to even begin to compare, but that's my view on it. That's why I do this, because doors will open and they will lead to experiences that I would never have if I hadn't been in this sort of language learning, or been on the polyglot journey, so to speak.
I couldn't have put it better. I'd say what's amazing about lifelong learning is that you will never be done with it.
Right.
There's never, it's a sandbox, like anything, any beautiful pursuit that you have in life. It's endless, and you can make your own path in it. That's just yours. You're given a starting point, which is your native language, and then from there, you're open. You can go learn whatever the heck you want, and it's just completely up to you. And it allows you to express yourself in a skill that, it's a skill that you can have with no tools, just your brain.
Yeah.
It's not like being an electrician or a mechanic, although it's similar in that you can take it wherever you go, but it's something that can really help in a bind when you least expect it. Or it will be the thing that will lead you to your spouse or perhaps that. But I myself, like you said, I'm learning, like I'm not in love with anyone who's Polish,
Right.
but I do have some Polish background, Polish-Lithuanian ancestors here and there, but I'm not learning it because of them. I'm learning it because it's this amazingly complex code. It's like being a code breaker, and I can't wait for the opportunity when this Slavic tongue, which to me just sounds like a bunch of like ch's and was and shiz, eventually it becomes like water. It becomes like this fluid that you can waft through without needing any support. Right. And I often make the analogy that like people assume fluency is this surface that you land on like a planet. Like when you land on the moon, you know when you're on the moon. Mm-hmm. But there's no such thing as landing on Jupiter or landing on Saturn because there's no surface on those planets. There's only density of gas. And that's exactly how language learning works. You think that you're deep enough in this language. You'll be deep enough when you know like every single kind of flower that exists in the world in this language, or when you know the fish.
Which is like saying never. It's a continuous effort, you know. You like in English, you don't know all the names of these things.
I don't, and I'm a native speaker.
Right, so you've proven that the pursuit of fluency, or at least, let's say, mastering the language, is a lifelong hobby, really. And I think there's something nice about that also. You shouldn't give yourself a too hard time either. If you don't know all the names of fish in German, you know, it's like, do you know it in English? No.
No, and I think that like you can consider yourself fluent as soon as you can have a decent conversation without needing to pause too much.
I agree.
But I'd say like learning a language as far as possible is a like Sisyphus pushing up the boulder. Mm-hmm. It's a completely futile effort, but it's your job as a human being to strive for the impossible.
Yeah. I think if you can get any language that you didn't grow up with to a C2 level, just using the European frameworks as a reference, if you can get any language to a C2 level whereby you're gonna get confused with a native speaker, to me that would be a huge achievement, and I would be very proud of myself if I did that. Unfortunately, I think also, first of all, it's very impractical, and second of all, I think there are very, very high diminishing returns once you get to, let's say, a comfortable C1 level. Like the time investment to get to the next level is absolutely ridiculous, because if you know, I don't remember the exact numbers, but you know, knowing 95% of the vocabulary in a book might not take you too far, but getting those last 5% is going to take longer than learning the first 95%, and probably a few times, because they're very rare. So for me, I don't think I would set that as a goal to become C2 perfect in a language. I think I'm very comfortable. I'd love to be good at it, like really advanced, probably C1. That I would be totally happy with a C1 level in my foreign languages. But of course, I would never consider myself done with any language. Just because I've reached C1 doesn't mean that I won't start forgetting the language immediately. Like with Russian, you know, if I made C1 Russian, I'd probably still have to study it once in a while, or at least do something to keep it up. Otherwise, it's just going to degenerate.
Yeah, there's always little nooks and crannies that you really have to learn in the moment. Like I had a friend who was C2 in English, like pretty much could be mistaken for a native speaker. Mm-hmm. And he said the words like he went to buy a mortar and pestle. And
yeah, that's very specialized. Yeah.
very specialized, as opposed to a pestle, or he was interested in the characters in the book. And it's like it's that level of fluency. Like, well, that's pretty much, I guess you would call it C1 problems, or problems
Right.
that affect only the very periphery of the language. And although they might give you away as a non-native, you're pretty much there.
Yeah.
You're pretty much don't need to work anymore.
Yeah.
But it's just, at that point, it becomes just a labor of love to sort of iron out the very, very fringes.
Yeah.
And
that's good.
And I hope to get to that level, of course, one day. But what's amazing about that 95-5 division is that, like, when you learn at the beginning levels, it's by leaps and bounds.
Yeah.
You'll just absolutely amaze yourself with this unbelievable progress every single time, and it will come like wave over wave of excitement. I think that excitement gets tapped out at a certain point when you say to yourself, like, I can pretty much read anything.
Yeah.
But it might not be the real case.
No, it's true. I think for my German, for instance, is pretty high level. I tested as a B1 with a written exam, so my spoken is probably higher, probably B2. And honestly, if you can do everything in a language and read pretty much any text that isn't a super complicated, poetic, old German text, then you also start to question yourself, like, why do I need to put more time into this language if I obviously already know it to such a useful level? Like in German, if there's a word I don't know, I know German well enough that I can explain around it or use synonyms or blah, blah, blah. I don't have to resort to English at all. And I understand 99% of what people say to me. So for me, that motivation is kind of hard to find, because it's like, well, why do I need to spend more time on this, let alone getting to C2 level, which would obviously take an immense effort and just a ridiculous project altogether. And I think we have a finite amount of time here, and I think I would rather have a lot of languages like that, a really good spoken language, rather than trying to perfect each one of them, although my German could still use a little help, especially in the written department. But yeah, that would be my desire, like a B1, B2 level in most of my languages. I think you get a lot of mileage out of that for a relatively small investment. But of course, I don't know what where I'm going to be in 2 years from now. I might be teaching at some school, and they say, hey, can you do the German class as well? And I'm like, no. And then you kind of, you have to get that language up somehow. Or maybe you want to start a translation business, and you feel like, okay, I know German B1, but that's not nearly enough to translate. So I have to get it up if that's my ambition. I don't know I don't know if life is at some point going to tell me, or maybe I'll move to Germany and I just need to improve it so I don't sound like an idiot. I mean, that's possible.
I had that exact same experience at my job, where I advertised myself as like I had a basic understanding of Italian.
Right.
And they said, okay, so now here's your golden opportunity. You're going to be researching throughout Italy specific data that you have to search for on Italian governmental websites. Go ahead. And I just thinking to myself, oh, that's going to be fun. But it had like, oh my gosh, I in this very specific field, I feel like I can talk about certain like demographic data absolutely perfectly in Italian now. Could I order a sandwich? Maybe less so.
It's funny,
but I'd say that like it's amazing how specialized your vocabulary can become if you only learn a language in a certain context.
Yeah, for sure.
I'd say like I cannot for the life of me read fiction. Like I know that I'm like there's certain things I can't do in language learning. I can't read fiction, and I can't Skype with someone like on italki, or I just get freaked out. I get to me, it just doesn't seem real enough. When I'm reading nonfiction, And I have a huge nonfiction book that's completely about introverts. Like, it's the Norwegian translation of the Susan Cain book called Quiet, which is about introversion.
Mm-hmm.
And this book contains vocabulary from pretty much every corner of life. It's not just like Lord of the Rings, where it's just going to be talking about like spears and dragons.
Sure.
This is about human daily interaction and achievement. And these words are just pretty important, even at that periphery level, even at that C1, C2 level. In order to really pick up and vacuum up all those peripheral words, it's all about reading.
Yeah. It is, and that's a big part of language as well. I mean, maybe not the first stages, but eventually reading will be important if you want to really have a full package in the language. So you can read those articles and maybe even more importantly, read people's emails and messages.
There was a great talk at the Berlin Gathering about, I think it was about getting, I'm not sure if it was the one about getting your advanced language skills up, or if it was some more scientifically oriented talk about the best, more like what the quantitative data says about the best learning methods. And the guy at the very beginning sort of echoed a sentiment that I've lived my whole life, where he just cannot stand the BS storyline of like a teacher self or colloquial book where they'll have the man and the woman go out and they buy a map. Yeah, like that's not my life. That's not like that. That's something I absolutely like turns off my brain.
Yeah.
And I asked this guy, like, is there a way that we can start learning languages with nonfiction? And he says it cannot be done. You have to, like, it is imperative as a language learner to begin your language learning journey with some beautiful story of this person traveling to that country and buying a map and making new friends.
Sure. But that does happen, though. There are some people, I frequently complain about the less useful sentences in Pimsleur, for instance. They often talk about booking hotels. I never stay in hotels. Like they talk about the family with 2 kids. I don't have a family or 2 kids. And so for me personally, it's quite irrelevant. So that's my view. But then somebody wrote to me and said, hey, I actually have a wife and 2 kids. So these sentences are very useful for me. And I'm like, yeah, okay, I guess that makes sense. But I guess it has to be underlined that everything I say here and write on the blog as well is from my perspective. So I guess the problem with these books is that they need to address a really wide audience. I don't know if there's any way of doing that without including like the family and the hotel booking and all these standard situations, but it'd be nice if some of them actually did some new stuff. I guess Benny's new books might be useful in that regard, to teach yourself language hacking.
I'd say, like, I feel like I was too harsh on Duolingo earlier, especially as someone who is actively volunteering there every day. And I have to say that the skills on Duolingo are organized by certain themes that are either grammatical or vocabulary oriented. Sure. But there's no storyline. And some people could call this a real disadvantage because you don't follow along. Mm-hmm. But when you have that expectation, your brain kind of, like, when you have an expectation about what something that's going to come up in a conversation, you don't pay attention to it as much as you would if it was a completely different sentence about ducks and tuxedos. Right. I'd say a big advantage of the Duolingo sentences being completely detached from context is that every single sentence presents a new scenario. Mm-hmm. And that variety is what keeps your mind active. Right. That's the theory. Yeah. We have a sentence in our course, my spaceship is full of herring. And it's an homage to my hovercraft is full of eels. Right. But we don't teach the word hovercraft or eels. but it's like so many times people complain about sentences like that. I would never use this sentence. I would never dream of using it. I actively hate this sentence. Or like the most apolitical sentence of all time could be perceived of as this great offense to them and their nation. And what's important is to come back on these sentences and say, hey, we threw you a curveball for a reason. So that your brain gets like out of its comfort zone.
Right. Yeah, exactly. That's the theory. But I don't know exactly to me, it seems like a trade-off, right? I mean, yeah, you get slightly more memorable sentences, but you're not likely to actually go out and use them. So you might learn more about how the language actually works, but it would be interesting. I mean, have they tested? Well, I guess they do test that regularly. But what about actually useful sentences versus unusual sentences? Because I think the Duolingo method is good with regards to what sentences they teach. I do believe that these funny sentences are part of what makes it memorable, but also what makes you want to keep doing it. So it's not like just, I have a suitcase, I have a bike, my mom is 8 years old. It's not these boring sentences. It's actually like, my duck eats a beer, or my bear is hungry, or something. You take it extra, you think about it more, because it's not these complete random useless sentences that every course has. But then on the other hand, I do remember myself, especially from something like Asimil, actually underline sentences where I say, okay, this is a sentence I would say verbatim sometimes. This would be really useful. And if I was a really productive student, which I'm definitely not, as most people listening would know, I would take that sentence out of the Asimil and put it into Memrise or Anki, and then learn it that way. I think that would be a great way to do it. So I think it's a trade-off at the end, but I do think there's certainly merit to it. It's not a negative about Duolingo.
I'd say what makes our courses different is that we have the sentences that are kind of strange, but it doesn't stop us from having the useful sentences too.
Right.
We have plenty of phrases and sentences in our course that are useful and that you would use verbatim. And it's not to discount the sentences that are weirder, because even though you might not say, my hovercraft is full of eels, you might still say, my room is full of crap, or my glass is full of milk, or my, just learning the constructions, regardless of the nouns or the adjectives that will flow in and out of the construction.
Yeah.
But learning the construction is the framework that it's building up in your mind, and having the ability to swap out whatever you want to is something that I think takes time as a language learner. It's a skill within language learning that you don't really know that you're working on if you're learning your first foreign language.
Right.
If you learn your first foreign language, you say to yourself, I basically need to parrot everything that I learn.
Mm-hmm.
And you don't realize that in order to speak a language, you need the ability to improvise and to make do with what you have.
Yeah.
And that's what causes which causes like a lot of like freeze ups when you're actually speaking it. Because you're saying like, oh my God, I don't know the word for defenestrate.
Right.
How am I going to make do in this conversation? You have to make do with what you have.
Exactly. Yeah, I definitely think it's a good way to provoke creativity in when you're designing language. I compare it sometimes to a jigsaw puzzle, where language learning is essentially just putting more and more pieces into the puzzle, and that way you sort of learn the whole picture at once, instead of just learning a few sentences at once, which would be part of the picture or whatever. With the sort of plotting in the jigsaw puzzle a piece at a time, you're going to learn a little bit about a lot of areas in the language instead of just learning the basic tourist phrases and then rattling them off from memory, which is a different skill from actually producing sentences. So I like that concept a lot, actually, but I don't know if it's totally apparent. Maybe people are not aware of this. That's the reason.
I thought it's a nice analogy because, especially if you build the frame of your puzzle, it's easy enough to intuit what's going to be in the middle.
Right.
And I'd also say on that same point, like the piece at a time method is something that I read about Benjamin Franklin doing. Okay. Who was a founding father of the United States. He was a very accomplished guy. But when he would play chess with one of his friends, if he were to lose a round of chess, the next time he played chess with his friend, he would have to have memorized like a certain amount of Italian grammar.
Okay.
And recite it to his friend as like a price for having lost the chess. And this was how he learned Italian.
That's interesting.
And it seems like, so many of the founding fathers of the U.S. were polymaths, and they were just obsessed with learning all kinds of weird fringe things, but also like scientific and linguistic things that I think that we think of as being easy only in our time. Because, imagine how difficult it would have been to learn Italian in the 13 colonies when it's extremely difficult to even find one Italian.
Yeah.
And
that's been quite
and you must have only had books. There was basically nothing else, and
the internet wasn't really, they hadn't really developed it yet.
It hadn't really taken off at that point. But yet you had, Latin and Greek were kind of like, we're very much at the starting point of like all education for the wealthy back then.
Sure.
And learning these other languages was just only an extension of that.
Yeah. Well, I like it, and this is sort of my favorite topic about the language. I guess the big picture of language learning, if you had to keep using the metaphor of a jigsaw puzzle, is really something that I appreciate, and it does mean, I think, if that's your focus, it does mean that you might be a little bit slow out of the gate. It might feel like you're not really getting anything done, but then once you start connecting the pieces and you start connecting the knowledge you have about grammar to newly learned vocabulary to seeing these patterns in every sentence, it really does accelerate quite quickly, and that's definitely exciting for me.
Absolutely. And it's something that can only be experienced yourself, and it's hard to explain this kind of joy to someone who's never done it.
Yeah. So the message is, people, do it.
Get out and do it.
Well, most of the people listening, I'm sure, are very familiar with what we're talking about. But if you're sitting out there and you haven't quite started learning that foreign language yet, or you're thinking about it, really just get started. It's well worth it.
Absolutely, and the joy is limitless. Yeah,
and you can end up making friends from all over the world, or suddenly staying in a hostel in Europe, or there's so many things that can happen due to languages. And just career-wise, we're living in a kind of, I would say, an uncertain time period where there's no such thing as job security, but if you have an extra language or two, you'll always be able to find work somewhere, somehow. And for me, that gives me some comfort that the skills that you build sort of to have fun with and mess around with and experience other cultures with is actually a usable skill. Like you mentioned earlier, it's something you can put on your resume that you actually speak Croatian or whatever, and people will or potential employers will see that and say, hey, we do a lot of business in that region, but we haven't had any applicants with English and Croatian before, so of course we chose you. That seems to me very obvious that that's going to be a huge thing of today and tomorrow.
It also just shows an intellectual curiosity.
Yeah.
That I think if you don't speak it from a familial standpoint, if it's never been in your family and you just learned it for the sake of learning it, then someone's going to look at that and say, we want someone who is worldly and interesting. Oh, yeah. And you don't want to I'm hesitant to say that you want to be interesting for being the sake of interesting, because that's a huge cultural fad in especially American culture nowadays. I'm an interesting person, so you need to look into me, and
I think it makes sense though. It's you're adding value to your character by learning other languages, and that's just intrinsic value. So you are by definition more interesting. If you went to let's say you went to Boston and you went to a cafe and you met someone, you said, oh yeah, I speak Norwegian, they're going to be like, well, why and how, and suddenly you become 50% more interesting. And
it's a conversation starter.
Yeah.
But I'd say you can't let that drown out the value of your own personal enjoyment of just having it in your head.
Yeah.
Even if it was a complete secret.
It should never be you shouldn't do it for other people. I think that's that's the verdict. It's basically you learn because you want to learn, and the value that it brings is sort of like a bonus. I think the job prospects is a bonus. I think the fact that I can meet people from all over the world is way more important than any job. I mean, you can always find a job somewhere, somehow, but it never hurts to have more qualifications and more languages to do it in.
And if you're not feeling it, don't force it.
Right.
I'd say if you are learning a language because you feel from some external pressure that this is what you should be doing, sure, you can give the language a chance and it might grab you. But if it doesn't grab you and you say to yourself, I need to learn this because everyone says it's useful, that's the worst. That is the worst thing.
It's going to be hard. Trust me. I've done that. It's very difficult to learn without the proper motivation. Sometimes you don't find proper motivation, so you kind of have to grind through it. But ideally, you should really find some reasons to learn the language. If not before you do it, then definitely after. I would say try and find some reasons, like a relative or a friend, or cultural reasons, TV shows, movies, whatever, music even, just anything.
Food.
Oh yeah.
I think food is the most enticing reason, I'd say, to learn. I think it can be especially because that's how you will connect all the enjoyment through the food.
For sure.
I don't know exactly how to express that other than when you taste something delicious and you know how to pronounce it. That is a great joy in life.
Oh yeah, it really is. Or just getting to know other cultures' food, or their eating culture, because it's usually very different. I'm sure when you got into Norwegian culture, you started to eat more fish and herring and whatever they eat up there. I don't quite know, but the cuisine is quite different from America for sure.
I'd say something that dawned on me today and was that there was a joke that was made in my history class in high school that comparing, and this is perhaps in bad taste, but it was comparing the German and Japanese cultures at the dawn of World War II. Mm-hmm. And they were saying, what do the Japanese and the Germans have in common besides fascism and expansionism at this time? And the other option was they both have pickles. They both love pickles. And I'm saying to myself, that's really odd and funny, but it doesn't really amount to much. But then I thought about it more as I started making my own pickles, and I've gotten like somewhat good at it because I think they're absolutely delicious.
Right.
But thinking about it really deeply, what is the pickle as a representation of the culture? A pickle is planning for the future.
Yeah.
Pickle is well preserved. It's food that can be preserved for a long period of time without refrigeration.
Yeah.
And that kind of planning is quintessential to German and Japanese economic culture. And like a lot of people would say it's also quintessential to the social culture.
Mm-hmm.
But like, I just happen to really like pickles. So
Well, it's great to find a hobby that you enjoy for sure.
It's just really fun, and it's very has nothing to do with language learning, but it's just to do something yourself and to say I did this all by myself.
Well, that is like language learning, though.
Absolutely,
you can definitely learn a language on your own. And you're planning for the future, too. So learning a language is a lot like making pickles.
I think it really is. That should be the title of the episode.
Right, making pickles.
Yeah, when you pickle something, you're not going to be enjoying it for at least a couple of days.
Right. Well, that's funny because people, I know that people's focus isn't what it used to be, and I know some people love to listen through all throughout the episodes, but I also know a lot of people cut it off. So it's kind of like if I called it, the pickled method or whatever, it would be kind of a bonus to the people who listen all the way through the end. I think that's kind of nice. I'll definitely do that. But
please do.
But yeah, thank you so much for coming on the show and sharing your passion. And we've had some technical problems, but this time I think we'll be good. We have a full recording from start to finish. I don't have to do too much to it. So thank you for sort of repeating yourself a little bit, but it's a topic that is worth repeating, and we got into some different tangents as well, so I definitely had some fun with it. Thank you so much.
It was my pleasure, Chris.
Awesome. Thank you so much for listening to the Actual Fluency podcast. If you want to come onto the podcast and share your language learning story, don't hesitate to apply on actualfluency.com/guest. See you in the next one.